You'll never amount to anything, Emma. You're just a pathetic nobody who thinks reading law books makes you special. Those were my sister Rachel's exact words to me 3 years ago at our parents' kitchen table in Phoenix. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. She was twirling her engagement ring, that massive diamond David had given her, while I sat there with my community college textbooks spread across the scratched wooden surface. The same table where we'd eaten countless family dinners, where I'd done homework every night since elementary school, where I'd announced my dream of becoming a lawyer only to watch my family exchange those looks. You know the ones. The pitying glances that say, "Oh honey, that's cute, but let's be realistic." Rachel had just gotten engaged to David Rodriguez, this hotshot attorney at one of Phoenix's most prestigious law firms, Morrison Associates. She was working as a marketing coordinator at some startup, nothing too demanding, but she acted like she was running Fortune 500 companies. Meanwhile, I was 24, working 2 jobs to pay for my paralegal certification at Phoenix Community College, and living in my childhood bedroom because I couldn't afford rent anywhere decent. The contrast wasn't lost on anyone, especially not on Rachel. But last Tuesday, everything changed. David's boss, senior partner Catherine Morrison herself, walked into that courtroom where I was presiding over a complex civil litigation case. She approached the bench after I'd adjourned for the day, extended her hand, and said those words that still give me chills. "Your Honor, it's an absolute honor to meet you. I've been following your career since your appointment. Brilliant work on the Henderson case last month. My name is Emma Martinez, and if you think you know how this story ends, you're probably wrong. Because when your own family writes you off as a failure, when they measure your worth by your bank account and your zip code, when they make you feel invisible in your own home, the journey to proving them wrong isn't just about success. It's about surviving the weight of their disappointment long enough to discover who you really are." The night Rachel called me a pathetic nobody started like any other family dinner. Mom had made her famous enchiladas, the ones that usually brought us all together despite our differences. Dad was talking about his construction business, how he'd landed a new contract for a shopping center development. Rachel was gushing about wedding plans, showing Mom different flower arrangements on her phone. I was quiet, picking at my food, exhausted from pulling a double shift at the diner where I waited tables, then rushing to my evening job cleaning offices downtown. I'd been carrying my constitutional law textbook in my backpack, planning to study during my break at the cleaning job. Community college wasn't exactly Harvard, but it was what I could afford. I was working toward my paralegal certification, hoping it would be a stepping stone to something bigger. Maybe law school someday, though I'd never said that out loud to my family. They had a way of making dreams feel foolish. Rachel noticed the textbook when I pulled it out to move it aside for dessert. She picked it up, flipped through the highlighted pages, and laughed. Not a kind laugh. The kind that cuts right through you. "Emma's still playing lawyer," she announced to the table, holding up my book like it was evidence in a trial. "Look at this, she's highlighted everything. Like she's actually going to use this stuff." Dad glanced over, that tired look in his eyes that I'd grown used to. "Maisha, maybe it's time to think about something more practical. There are good jobs at the plant. Benefits, steady pay." "I don't want to work at the plant, Dad. I want to study law." "Study law?" Rachel's voice pitched higher. "Emma, you barely graduated high school. You're taking classes at community college with a bunch of teenagers. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Do you know what David makes? Do you know where he went to school? Arizona State University College of Law. That's a real law school. That's what real lawyers do." The comparison stung because it was always there, hovering over every family gathering. David, the successful attorney with his expensive suits and his BMW. Emma, the waitress with community college dreams and second-hand textbooks. Mom tried to smooth things over, the way she always did. "Rachel, don't be so hard on your sister. Education is important." "Education, yes. but realistic education. She's 24 years old, Mom. Most people her age are starting careers, not playing around with impossible dreams. That's when I made my mistake. I defended myself. It's not impossible. I'm getting good grades. My instructor says I have real potential. Maybe I could even go to law school someday. The silence that followed was deafening. Then Rachel started laughing again, but this time it was worse. It was the laugh you give to a child who says they want to be a dinosaur when they grow up. Law school? Emma, do you have any idea what law school costs? Do you know what kind of people go to law school? You're working at Mel's Diner and cleaning toilets at night. You live in Mom and Dad's spare bedroom. You drive a car that's older than some of your classmates. She leaned forward, her engagement ring catching the kitchen light. You'll never amount to anything, Emma. You're just a pathetic nobody who thinks reading law books makes you special. The words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, though they were, but because part of me had been thinking the same thing. Part of me had been wondering if I was delusional, if I was wasting time and money on a dream that was too big for someone like me. I looked around the table. Dad was staring at his plate. Mom was fidgeting with her napkin. Nobody contradicted Rachel. Nobody defended me. The silence stretched until it felt like agreement. I stood up, gathered my things, and walked to my room without saying another word. I could hear them talking in low voices after I left, probably discussing my phase, and when I'd finally come to my senses. That night, lying in my childhood bed, surrounded by law books and study guides, I made a decision. Rachel was wrong. I wasn't pathetic, and I wasn't a nobody. I was going to prove it, not just to her, but to myself. The next morning, I did something I'd been too scared to do before. I walked into the admissions office at Arizona State University College of Law and picked up an application. The same law school David had graduated from. The same law school Rachel had used as a weapon against my dreams. The admissions counselor, Mrs. Patterson, was kind but realistic. Your community college grades are excellent, she said, reviewing my transcript. But law school is competitive. You'll need to take the LSAT, and you'll need to score well. Very well. What kind of score would I need? For someone without a traditional 4-year degree, you'd need to be in the top 15%. Maybe higher. I bought LSAT prep books that same day, spending money I didn't have on materials I wasn't sure I was smart enough to use. But I studied. God, did I study. I studied during my breaks at the diner, between cleaning jobs, late into the night when the house was quiet. I studied on buses, in parking lots, anywhere I could find a few minutes in decent light. The months that followed were the hardest of my life. My family thought I was going through some kind of crisis. Rachel would make comments about my law school fantasy whenever she visited. She'd bring David around sometimes, and he'd be polite but distant, the way successful people are with the help. Still hitting the books? He'd ask, glancing at my study materials with what I thought was condescension but might have just been discomfort. How do you talk to your fiancé's sister, who's trying to enter your profession through the back door? Every day, I'd answer, not mentioning that I was averaging 4 hours of sleep a night, that I'd given up everything social, that I was living on ramen and coffee. The LSAT was scheduled for October. By September, I was taking practice tests that put me in the 92nd percentile. Not perfect, but good enough. Maybe. I took the test on a Saturday morning in a sterile classroom at ASU, surrounded by kids who looked like they'd been preparing for this moment their whole lives. Designer clothes, expensive watches, the confidence that comes from never doubting you belong somewhere. I wore my best dress, a black one I'd bought for job interviews, and carried my pencils in a Ziploc bag because I couldn't afford a proper pencil case. But when that test booklet opened, none of that mattered. For 4 hours, it was just me and the questions, and I knew I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The results came back 6 weeks later, 94th percentile, high enough for any law school in the country. I applied to 5 schools, including ASU. I wrote essays about growing up in a working-class family, about understanding the law from the perspective of people who usually can't afford good legal representation, about wanting to use my education to bridge the gap between justice and accessibility. Arizona State accepted me with a partial scholarship, not enough to cover everything, but enough to make it possible if I was willing to take on debt and keep working. I was 25 when I started law school, older than most of my classmates, still living at home to save money. Rachel was planning her wedding, a lavish affair at the Arizona Biltmore. I wasn't in the wedding party, officially because she wanted to keep it small. But we both knew it was because I didn't fit the image she wanted to project. Law school was brutal. Not just academically, though the workload was crushing, but socially. Most of my classmates came from families where professional success was expected, not hoped for. They had parents who were lawyers and doctors and business owners. They had trust funds and family connections, and the kind of confidence that comes from never wondering if you belong. I still worked at the diner on weekends, still lived at home, still drove my ancient Honda Civic to school every day. But I was holding my own academically. Better than holding my own. I was excelling. Professor Williams taught constitutional law, the same subject I'd been reading about in those community college textbooks. He was intimidating, one of those professors who cold-called students and could destroy your confidence with a single question. But he was also brilliant, and he recognized something in me that I was still learning to see in myself. "Ms. Martinez," he said after class one day during my second semester, "have you considered judicial externships? There are opportunities for students who show particular aptitude for constitutional analysis." Now, I had no idea what he was talking about, but I nodded like I did. Judge Patricia Hernandez is looking for extern students. She sits on the Superior Court here in Maricopa County. Complex civil litigation, constitutional issues. It's unpaid, but the experience is invaluable. Unpaid meant I'd have to pick up extra shifts at the diner to compensate, but I said yes immediately. This was the kind of opportunity I dreamed about, the kind that could change everything. Judge Hernandez was everything I hoped to become someday. Brilliant, fair, respected. She was also Latina, like me, and she understood what it meant to fight for your place in rooms where people questioned whether you belonged. "You remind me of myself at your age," she told me during my first week. "Hungry. Not just for success, but for justice." That's rarer than you might think, even in law school. Working in her chambers was like getting a master class in legal reasoning. I researched cases, drafted memos, observed hearings. I learned how the law worked in practice, not just in theory. And I learned that I was good at it. Really good. Judge Hernandez became more than a supervisor. She became a mentor. Someone who saw potential I was still afraid to claim. "Have you thought about what kind of law you want to practice?" she asked one afternoon as we reviewed a particularly complex civil rights case. "I'm not sure. Maybe public defense or legal aid. Something that helps people who can't usually afford good representation." She smiled. "Those are noble goals, but don't limit yourself. The law needs people like you, at every level, including on the bench someday." The bench? I'd never even considered it. Judges seemed like mythical figures, people who existed in a completely different stratosphere. But Judge Hernandez made it sound possible, like a natural progression rather than an impossible dream. My grades that semester were the best of my law school career. Top 5% of my class. I made law review, something I'd thought was reserved for the kids with family connections and Ivy League undergraduate degrees. At home, my success was met with polite acknowledgement and subtle skepticism. "That's nice, Maija," Dad would say when I shared good news, but I could see him wondering when I'd come back to reality. Rachel was busy with wedding planning and barely noticed my achievements, except to occasionally comment that law school was keeping me busy. But David noticed. I could see it in the way he looked at me now, less like his fiancé's struggling sister and more like someone who might actually make it in his profession. He started asking me about my classes, about my externship, about my career plans. The conversations were brief, but they felt different. More respectful. The wedding was in June, right after my second year ended. It was everything Rachel had dreamed of. Elegant, expensive, filled with Phoenix's legal and business elite. I wore a dress I'd bought on sale at Nordstrom Rack. And I felt both proud of how far I'd come and acutely aware of how far I still had to go. During the reception, I found myself at a table with several attorneys from David's firm. They were discussing a recent Supreme Court decision, and without thinking, I joined the conversation. I'd written a law review article on the exact constitutional issue they were debating. The conversation shifted when I started talking. These weren't people used to being impressed by the bride's sister. But my analysis was sophisticated, my knowledge current. One of the senior associates asked for my contact information, said they might have summer internship opportunities. Rachel noticed. I saw her watching from across the room, her expression unreadable. Later, during the father-daughter dance, she made her way over to me. "You seem to fit right in with David's colleagues," she said. It wasn't exactly a compliment, but it wasn't an insult either. "It's a good group of lawyers," I replied carefully. "David says you're doing well in school. Top of your class or something." "Top 5%. She nodded, looking thoughtful. "Maybe you'll actually make it after all." It was the closest thing to an apology I was going to get, and maybe the closest thing to encouragement she'd ever given me. My third year of law school flew by. I had a summer internship at Morrison Associates, David's firm, where I worked on cases that would have intimidated me 3 years earlier. I was writing briefs, conducting research, even sitting in on client meetings. The other attorneys treated me as a colleague, not as the intern. Catherine Morrison, the senior partner, was a legend in Phoenix legal circles. She'd built the firm from nothing, had argued cases before the Arizona Supreme Court, had been mentioned as a potential federal judge. She was intimidating and brilliant, and exactly the kind of lawyer I hoped to become. We didn't interact much during my internship. She was busy with high-profile cases, and I was just one of several summer interns. But I knew she was aware of my work, because her feedback, filtered through other attorneys, was consistently positive. I graduated law school summa cum laude, third in my class. The girl who'd been called a pathetic nobody had finished ahead of kids from Harvard undergrad, ahead of senators' sons and federal judges' daughters. Judge Hernandez was in the audience, beaming with pride. My parents were there too, finally understanding that this wasn't a phase or a fantasy. Rachel and David came to graduation. Rachel hugged me afterward, and for the first time in years, it felt genuine. "I'm proud of you," she said, and I believed her. The bar exam was the final hurdle. 2 days of testing that would determine whether all those years of work meant anything. I passed on the first try, with a score high enough to qualify for admission to practice in federal court. I joined the Maricopa County Public Defender's Office as a staff attorney. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was exactly what I'd dreamed of doing, representing people who couldn't afford private counsel, making sure everyone had access to quality legal representation, regardless of their bank account. I was good at it, really good. I won cases that other attorneys said were unwinnable. I built a reputation for thorough preparation and creative legal arguments. Within 2 years, I was handling complex felony cases and training new attorneys. Judge Hernandez and I stayed in touch. She'd been appointed to the Arizona Court of Appeals, and she continued to mentor me as my career developed. When a position opened on the Superior Court, she encouraged me to apply. "You're ready," she said. "More than ready. The bench needs someone with your background, your perspective." I was 31 when I was appointed to the Maricopa County Superior Court. 31 years old, and I was going to be a judge. The youngest person ever appointed to that court, and one of the few who'd grown up in a working-class family. The appointment process was rigorous. Background checks, interviews, public hearings. My family was questioned, my finances examined, my cases reviewed. Throughout it all, I kept thinking about that night in my parents' kitchen when Rachel called me a pathetic nobody. How wrong she'd been. How wrong I'd almost let myself believe she was. The swearing-in ceremony was held in the same courthouse where I'd worked as an extern with Judge Hernandez. My parents sat in the front row, tears streaming down their faces. Judge Hernandez administered the oath. Rachel and David were there, along with colleagues from the public defender's office and law school classmates who'd scattered to firms across the state. When Judge Hernandez asked me to repeat the oath, her voice was filled with emotion. "Do you, Emma Martinez, solemnly swear to administer justice without respect to persons, and do equal right to the poor and to the rich, and that you will faithfully and impartially discharge and perform all the duties incumbent upon you as judge of the Superior Court of Arizona, according to the best of your ability and understanding, agreeably to the Constitution and laws of the United States and of this state, so help you God?" "I do," I said, and meant every word. My first day on the bench was terrifying and exhilarating. I wore the black robe I'd dreamed of for years, sat in the chair I'd worked toward since that night Rachel tried to crush my dreams. The courtroom was full of attorneys, some of whom I'd worked with, others who were meeting me for the first time. The cases were complex: civil litigation, constitutional challenges, disputes involving millions of dollars in fundamental rights. Exactly the kind of law I'd studied in those community college textbooks, now applied at the highest level of the state court system. 3 months into my tenure, a major case came before my court. A civil rights lawsuit involving constitutional issues I'd written about in Law Review, issues I'd discussed with Judge Hernandez during my externship. The case had attracted attention from legal scholars and civil rights organizations across the country. The plaintiff was represented by Morrison Associates, David's firm, Catherine Morrison's firm. I should have expected it, but somehow it still surprised me when I saw the case assignment. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. I'd spent weeks reviewing the briefs, researching precedents, preparing for what I knew would be a challenging set of legal questions. The courtroom was packed with attorneys, law students, and journalists covering the case. Catherine Morrison herself was arguing for the plaintiff. I'd seen her in court before, but never while I was the presiding judge. She was commanding, articulate, every bit as brilliant as her reputation suggested. The hearing went well. Both sides presented strong arguments, and I was able to ask the kinds of probing questions that would help me reach the right decision. It was exactly the kind of case I'd hoped to handle as a judge. Complex, important, requiring careful analysis of constitutional principles. After I adjourned for the day, I was gathering my notes when I heard someone approach the bench. I looked up to see Catherine Morrison, alone in the now empty courtroom. "Your Honor," she said, extending her hand with a smile I'd never seen before. "It's an absolute honor to meet you. I've been following your career since your appointment. Brilliant work on the Henderson case last month." The Henderson case had been another complex civil matter, one where I'd written a detailed opinion that had been cited favorably by the Arizona Court of Appeals. I was proud of that decision, but I was surprised that Catherine Morrison had been following my work so closely. "Thank you, Ms. Morrison. That means a great deal coming from you. I have to say, your questioning today was exceptional. You clearly understand the constitutional issues at a level that's rare, even among experienced judges." She paused, then smiled wider. "I also have to say, I'm impressed by your journey. From community college to the Superior Court bench. That's not a path many people could navigate successfully." My journey. She knew about my background, about where I'd started. Instead of seeing it as a weakness or an anomaly, she was treating it as an achievement. "It's been a long road," I said carefully. "The best ones usually are. The law needs more people like you, Your Honor. People who understand what justice means, from all perspectives, not just from the privileged ones." We talked for a few more minutes about the case, about legal theory, about the direction of constitutional law. It was the kind of conversation I dreamed of having when I was highlighting those community college textbooks, the kind of intellectual exchange that made all the years of struggle worthwhile. As she was leaving, Catherine Morrison turned back. "Your Honor, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but your reputation in the legal community is remarkable. Everyone's talking about the quality of your decisions. Your judicial temperament, you're going to go far." After she left, I sat alone in my courtroom for a long time. I thought about that conversation, about how far I'd come, about the girl who'd been called a pathetic nobody, and who was now being praised by one of the most respected attorneys in the state. But mostly I thought about family dinner the following Sunday, and how I was going to tell this story. That Sunday dinner felt different from the moment I walked through my parents' front door. The same kitchen where Rachel had torn down my dreams 3 years earlier now seemed smaller somehow, as if my perspective had shifted along with everything else in my life. Mom was setting out her best dishes, the ones usually reserved for holidays and special occasions. Dad had actually put on a button-down shirt instead of his usual weekend t-shirt. "Misha, we're so proud of you," Mom said, embracing me with tears already forming in her eyes. Judge Martinez. Our daughter, the judge. The title still felt surreal. 3 months into my appointment, and I was still getting used to the weight of the robe, the formality of the courtroom, the way attorneys addressed me with deference that I'd spent years earning but somehow hadn't expected to feel so profound. Rachel and David arrived exactly at 4, fashionably punctual as always. Rachel carried a bottle of expensive champagne, the kind she usually brought to her own celebrations but had never brought to anything involving me. David was wearing one of his perfectly tailored suits, even for family dinner, but his smile seemed more genuine than I'd seen in years. "Congratulations, Your Honor," David said, and I could hear real respect in his voice. Not the polite acknowledgement he'd given my law school achievements, but the recognition of a peer. "The legal community is buzzing about your appointment. Catherine Morrison mentioned you were handling the Riverside development case." Catherine Morrison had mentioned me to David. The senior partner at one of Phoenix's most prestigious law firms was discussing my work with her associates. 6 months ago, I would have been intimidated by that knowledge. Now it felt like validation. "It's a complex case," I replied, sitting down at the same table where Rachel had called me pathetic. "Constitutional issues involving due process and property rights. The kind of law I've been studying for years." "Studying is one thing," Rachel said, uncorking the champagne with practiced ease. "But actually presiding over those cases, making decisions that affect people's lives, that's incredible, Emma. I mean, I still can't believe my little sister is a judge." Little sister. She'd always used that phrase to diminish me, to remind me of my place in the family hierarchy. Tonight it sounded different, almost affectionate. Dad raised his glass when Rachel finished pouring. "To Emma, who proved that dreams aren't foolish if you're willing to work for them." The toast was simple, but coming from Dad, who'd spent years encouraging me toward practical choices, it meant everything. We clinked glasses, and for the first time in memory, I felt like I truly belonged at this table. "Tell us about the courtroom," Mom said as we began eating. "What's it like up there behind that big desk?" "It's called a bench, Mom, and it's honestly incredible. The responsibility is enormous, but it's exactly what I hoped it would be. Every case matters. Every decision impacts real people's lives in meaningful ways." I told them about my recent cases, carefully avoiding anything confidential, but sharing the intellectual challenges, the satisfaction of applying legal principles to complex problems. The weight of ensuring justice was served fairly. Rachel listened intently, asking questions that showed she was genuinely interested rather than just being polite. "Do you ever get nervous? I mean, what if you make the wrong decision?" "Every judge worries about that," I admitted. "But that's why we spend so much time researching, consulting precedents, considering all angles. The law provides a framework, but applying it thoughtfully is what makes the difference between justice and just following rules." David nodded approvingly. "That's exactly right. I've seen too many judges who rule from habit, rather than careful analysis. Your reputation for thorough preparation is already well established. My reputation. 3 months on the bench, and I apparently had a reputation among Phoenix attorneys. The girl who'd been dismissed as delusional for wanting to study law was now being discussed in legal circles as a judge worth watching. "How did this happen so fast?" Rachel asked, and for the first time her question didn't sound like skepticism. "I mean, you've only been practicing for what, 4 years?" 5 years, but judicial appointments aren't just about time and practice. They look at your legal writing, your trial experience, your understanding of constitutional principles, your character, your potential to serve justice effectively. I didn't mention the extensive background investigation, the interviews with dozens of people from my past, the scrutiny of every decision I'd made since law school. Rachel didn't need to know how thoroughly they'd examined my life, looking for any hint that I wasn't ready for this responsibility. "The youngest person ever appointed to Maricopa County Superior Court," Dad added proudly. The newspaper article said that. There had been newspaper coverage of my appointment, something I still found surreal. The Arizona Republic had run a feature about my background, my path from community college to the bench, my commitment to equal justice. They'd interviewed Professor Williams, Judge Hernandez, colleagues from the public defender's office. All of them had said things about my character and abilities that made me wonder if they were talking about the same person who used to doubt herself so severely. "The article was beautiful," Mom said. "I've saved 10 copies." "What did Catherine Morrison say when you met her in court?" David asked. leaning forward with obvious curiosity. I described our conversation after the hearing, how she'd complimented my judicial approach and mentioned following my career. What I didn't share was how profoundly that moment had affected me. Catherine Morrison was everything I aspired to be professionally: brilliant, respected, successful without compromising her integrity. Having her acknowledge my work felt like crossing some invisible threshold into legitimacy. "She's not easily impressed," David said thoughtfully. "For her to seek you out after a hearing to specifically mention your judicial work, that's significant. Catherine Morrison doesn't give empty compliments." "What's she like?" Rachel asked. "I've heard she's intimidating." "She's formidable," I replied carefully, "but in the best way. She commands respect through competence, not intimidation. She's exactly the kind of attorney who makes the legal profession better." We talked through dinner about my cases, about the legal profession, about how different my life was now compared to 3 years ago. The conversation flowed naturally, without the tension that had marked family gatherings for so long. Rachel seemed genuinely interested in my work, asking intelligent questions about judicial process and legal theory. "Do you remember," she said as Mom brought out dessert, "when you used to carry those law books everywhere? I thought you were just trying to look important." The memory stung, but differently now. "I remember you thinking it was pretentious." Rachel looked down at her plate. "I was wrong about a lot of things back then. I was so focused on conventional success, on what looked impressive from the outside, that I couldn't see what you were actually building." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was acknowledgement. Rachel was admitting that her dismissal of my dreams had been misguided, that her definition of success had been too narrow. "We all were," Dad said quietly. "I kept pushing you toward the plant job because it seemed secure, predictable. I didn't understand that security isn't just about steady paychecks. It's about building something meaningful." The conversation continued late into the evening, longer than family dinners usually lasted. We talked about my plans, about cases coming up on my docket, about the responsibility of judicial service. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like my family saw me clearly, not as the daughter who'd taken too long to figure out her life, but as someone who'd found her calling and excelled at it. When Rachel and David were getting ready to leave, Rachel pulled me aside. "Emma, I owe you an apology. A real one, not just acknowledgement that I was wrong." She took a deep breath. "That night when I called you pathetic, when I said you'd never amount to anything, I was projecting my own insecurities onto you. I was so afraid of taking risks myself that I couldn't handle watching you take them successfully. The apology was more than I'd expected, more than I'd thought I needed, but hearing it felt like a weight lifting, like a wound finally healing properly." "I was scared too," I admitted. "Some nights I wondered if you were right, if I was delusional to think I could make it in law. But you kept going anyway. That's what I could never understand back then. How you kept believing in yourself even when the evidence seemed against you." We hugged, and it felt different from the polite embraces we'd exchanged for years. It felt like sisters reconnecting after too long apart. The drive home gave me time to process the evening. My family's transformation felt almost as surreal as my own success. The people who'd once questioned my dreams were now celebrating my achievements, not just politely, but with genuine pride and understanding. My phone rang as I was pulling into my driveway. Judge Hernandez's name appeared on the screen. "Emma, I hope I'm not calling too late. I wanted to discuss something with you." "Of course, Judge, what's on your mind?" "I've been talking to colleagues on the Court of Appeals about your work. Your Henderson decision has generated significant positive attention, and your handling of complex constitutional issues is impressive. There's talk about your potential for appellate work down the line." Appellate work? The Arizona Court of Appeals, where Judge Hernandez now served, was the next level of the judicial system. Cases there involve pure legal analysis, constitutional interpretation, decisions that shaped law for the entire state. I appreciate the confidence, but I've only been on the Superior Court for 3 months. The best judges aren't measured by tenure alone. They're measured by the quality of their legal reasoning, their commitment to justice, their ability to handle complex cases with wisdom and fairness. You've demonstrated all of those qualities. We talked for 20 minutes about judicial philosophy, about the cases I was handling, about the long-term trajectory of my career, Judge Hernandez had been more than a mentor. She'd been a guide through the sometimes bewildering world of judicial service. One more thing, Emma. The Arizona Bar Association is planning their annual judicial conference next month. They've asked me to recommend a Superior Court judge to speak about innovative approaches to civil litigation. I'd like to suggest you. Speaking at the State Bar Conference would put me in front of hundreds of attorneys, judges, and legal scholars. 3 months into my judicial career, and I was being asked to share my insights with the state's legal establishment. I'm honored by the suggestion, but are you sure I'm ready for that level of visibility? Emma, you've been ready for every challenge that's come your way. This is just the next step. After we hung up, I sat in my car for a long time, thinking about the trajectory of my life over the past 3 years. From community college student to Superior Court judge, to potential appellate candidate, to State Bar Conference speaker. Each step had seemed impossible until it happened. My phone buzzed with a text message from Rachel. "Thank you for dinner tonight. I'm proud to be your sister. Can't wait to hear about your next case." For years, I'd craved that acknowledgement from Rachel, that simple statement of pride from someone whose opinion had mattered too much to me. Now that I had it, I realized something important. I no longer needed it for validation. My sense of accomplishment, my confidence in my abilities, my understanding of my own worth, had become internal rather than dependent on family approval. The next morning brought a new week of cases, new legal challenges, new opportunities to serve justice. As I put on my judicial robe and prepared for another day on the bench, I thought about that conversation with Catherine Morrison, about Rachel's apology, about Judge Hernandez's confidence in my future. 3 months ago, putting on this robe for the first time had felt like wearing a costume, like pretending to be something I wasn't sure I could become. Now it felt natural, earned, like the external symbol of something I'd built from the inside out. My first case of the day was a complex commercial litigation matter involving constitutional questions about government regulation and private property rights. The kind of case that required exactly the kind of thorough legal analysis I'd been developing since those community college constitutional law classes. As the attorneys presented their arguments, I found myself thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment. Every late night studying, every double shift at the diner, every moment of doubt, every small victory had been preparation for this responsibility. The law was complex, but my understanding was solid. The constitutional principles were intricate, but my analysis was thorough. The stakes were high, but my preparation was complete. When I called for a brief recess to review some precedents, I noticed Catherine Morrison sitting in the back of the courtroom, observing the proceedings. She caught my eye and nodded approvingly, a subtle acknowledgement that my handling of the case was meeting her professional standards. After court adjourned, I found a message from Professor Williams waiting in my chambers. The law school was creating a scholarship program for non-traditional students, people who were taking unconventional paths into legal education. They wanted to name it after me, the Emma Martinez Scholarship for Academic Excellence and Professional Promise. My name on a scholarship that would help other students who'd been told their dreams were unrealistic, who'd been dismissed as pathetic nobodies, who'd been encouraged to choose practical over passionate. I thought about that scared 24-year-old who'd walked into the ASU admissions office 3 years ago, terrified that she wasn't smart enough or prepared enough or worthy enough to belong in law school. She'd been wrong about almost everything except the most important thing. She'd been right to believe that dreams backed by determination could become reality. The transformation hadn't just been professional. It had been personal, psychological, fundamental. I'd learned to trust my own judgment, to value my own perspective, to understand that worthiness isn't granted by others but developed from within. That evening, I started preparing for the Bar Association conference presentation. The topic they'd suggested was innovative judicial approaches to constitutional analysis and civil litigation. 3 years ago, I would have been intimidated by such a technical, scholarly subject. Now it felt like an opportunity to share insights I'd developed through careful study and practical application. As I worked on my presentation, outlining my judicial philosophy and approach to complex constitutional questions, I realized that Rachel had been wrong about more than just my potential. She'd been wrong about what success looked like, about what mattered in building a meaningful career, about the relationship between conventional markers of achievement and actual accomplishment. Success wasn't the expensive engagement ring or the prestigious firm or the BMW in the driveway. Success was the ability to serve justice effectively, to apply legal principles thoughtfully, to make decisions that protected rights and upheld the rule of law. Success was earning the respect of colleagues through competence, not connections. My phone rang again. This time it was David. "Emma, I hope you don't mind me calling. I wanted to follow up on our conversation yesterday about the Morrison case. We talked for 15 minutes about legal strategy, about constitutional interpretation, about the complexities of civil rights litigation. The conversation was between equals, two attorneys discussing sophisticated legal concepts with mutual respect. I have to say," David concluded, "having you on the bench is going to make all of us better attorneys. You ask the kinds of questions that force us to think more deeply about our arguments." After we hung up, I reflected on how our relationship had evolved. David had gone from being my sister's successful fiancé who tolerated my presence to being a professional colleague who sought out my insights. The change wasn't just in his perception of me, but in my perception of myself. 3 years ago, I'd been intimidated by David's success, his education, his position at a prestigious firm. Now I understood that we'd simply taken different paths toward the same destination, meaningful work in service of justice. His path through traditional law school and private practice was valid, but so was mine through community college and public service. The week continued with more cases, more legal challenges, more opportunities to apply the skills I'd been developing for years. Each decision reinforced my confidence in my judicial abilities. Each case deepened my understanding of the law's practical application. Friday brought news that the Henderson case opinion I'd written had been cited favorably by the Arizona Supreme Court in a related matter. My legal reasoning was now part of Arizona constitutional law, influencing how similar cases would be decided across the state. The citation came in a case argued by Morrison and Associates. Catherine Morrison herself had quoted my analysis in her brief to the state's highest court, and they'd incorporated my reasoning into their decision. My judicial work was being validated at the highest levels of the state legal system. That weekend, I drove past the community college where I'd started this journey. The campus looked smaller than I remembered, but not in a diminishing way. It looked like the beginning it had been, the foundation upon which everything else had been built. I parked and walked through the campus, past the classroom where I'd first studied constitutional law, past the library where I'd spent countless hours preparing for the LSAT, past the cafeteria where I'd eaten lunch while reading cases, and dreaming about a future that had seemed impossible. A group of students was studying on the lawn, textbooks spread around them, the same mixture of hope and anxiety I remembered from my own time there. One of them was highlighting a constitutional law textbook, just like I had been when Rachel called me pathetic for thinking those books would matter. I wanted to tell them that it would matter, that every page they studied was building towards something significant, that their dreams weren't too big just because they were starting from somewhere that others might consider too small. But they needed to discover that for themselves, just like I had. The drive home took me past my parents' house, past the diner where I'd worked through law school, past the courthouse where I now served as a judge. The geography of my transformation, the physical markers of a journey that had been as much internal as external. Sunday dinner was at my apartment this time, the first time I'd hosted family since becoming a judge. I'd bought a dining room table, proper dishes, the kinds of things that marked a settled adult life rather than the temporary existence I'd maintained for so long. Rachel and David brought flowers and wine. Mom brought homemade tamales. Dad brought his camera, wanting to document what he called our daughter's new life. "This is beautiful, Emma," Rachel said, looking around my apartment. "It feels like you, but more confident somehow." The space did reflect my transformation. Law books on built-in shelves, art I'd chosen because I loved it rather than because it was affordable, furniture that was comfortable rather than just functional, the physical environment of someone who'd stopped apologizing for taking up space. Over dinner, we talked about my upcoming Bar Association presentation. about the cases I was handling, about the scholarship program that would bear my name. The conversation flowed easily, naturally, without the undercurrent of tension that had marked family gatherings for so long. "I keep thinking about something you said last week," Rachel mentioned as we were finishing dessert. "About security being more than steady paychecks. About building something meaningful. I've been wondering if I'm building anything meaningful in my own career." It was a vulnerable admission from someone who'd always projected complete confidence in her life choices. Rachel was questioning her own path in a way she'd never done before. "What would meaningful look like for you?" I asked. "I don't know exactly. But watching you build your career, seeing how passionate you are about your work, it's made me realize that I've been focused on external markers of success without thinking about what actually fulfills me." We talked about purpose, about the difference between impressive careers and satisfying ones, about the courage required to pursue work that matters, even when it's challenging. Rachel was discovering what I'd learned years earlier, that other people's definitions of success might not align with your own sense of purpose. The evening ended with plans for more regular family dinners, with Rachel asking if she could visit my courtroom sometime to observe proceedings, with David mentioning cases where my judicial opinions had influenced his firm's legal strategies. As they were leaving, Rachel hugged me with the kind of warmth that had been missing from our relationship for too long. "I love you, Emma, and I'm sorry it took me so long to see how extraordinary you are." "I love you too," I replied, and meant it completely. After they left, I sat at my dining room table with my laptop, continuing work on my Bar Association presentation. The title I'd chosen was From Community College to Constitutional Law, An Unconventional Path to Judicial Service. The presentation would tell my story, but more importantly, it would argue for the value of diverse backgrounds in judicial service, for the importance of judges who understood the law from multiple perspectives, for the strength that comes from having overcome obstacles rather than having avoided them. As I wrote, I thought about that night 3 years ago, when Rachel had tried to convince me that my dreams were unrealistic. She'd been measuring my potential against conventional markers of success, against traditional paths to achievement, against her own limited understanding of what was possible. But dreams don't require permission from people who can't envision them. They require commitment from the person brave enough to pursue them, despite skepticism, despite obstacles, despite moments of doubt. My phone buzzed with a text from Judge Hernandez. "Saw the Supreme Court citation of your Henderson opinion. Brilliant work. The legal community is taking notice of your contributions to constitutional jurisprudence." Constitutional jurisprudence. My analysis of legal principles was now part of the body of law that would guide future cases, future judges, future interpretations of citizens' rights and governmental powers. 3 years ago, I'd been a community college student highlighting passages in a used constitutional law textbook. Tonight, I was a Superior Court judge, whose constitutional analysis was being cited by the state's highest court. The transformation was complete, but it wasn't really an ending. It was a beginning, the start of a judicial career that could span decades, that could influence countless cases, that could contribute to the development of law and the protection of justice. As I finished my presentation and prepared for bed, I thought about tomorrow's court calendar: complex cases, important decisions, opportunities to serve justice thoughtfully and fairly. The work I dreamed of doing when I first opened those community college textbooks. Rachel had called me a pathetic nobody who would never amount to anything. But she'd been wrong about everything, except one thing. I had been a nobody, just not in the way she meant. I'd been nobody's definition of a future judge, nobody's expectation of success, nobody's prediction of achievement. And that had been exactly what I needed to become somebody who could surprise everyone, including myself. The girl who'd been dismissed as delusional for wanting to study law was now the judge whose legal reasoning was shaping constitutional interpretation across Arizona. The journey from that kitchen table confrontation to this moment had been longer and more challenging than I could have imagined, but also more rewarding than I'd dared to hope. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new challenges, new opportunities to serve justice. Tonight, I was exactly where I belonged, in my own space, confident in my abilities, secure in my achievements, ready for whatever came next. The pathetic nobody had become, Your Honor, and the transformation was just the beginning. The weeks following my family dinner revelation brought challenges I hadn't anticipated. Being recognized as a competent judge was one thing, but navigating the complex politics of the legal community while maintaining my judicial integrity was proving to be an entirely different skill set. My calendar was packed with increasingly complex cases. The Riverside development matter that Catherine Morrison had mentioned was consuming most of my research time. It involved a constitutional challenge to a city ordinance that opponents claimed violated due process rights, while supporters argued was necessary for urban planning. The case had attracted attention from property rights advocates, urban development groups, and constitutional law scholars across the Southwest. What made it particularly challenging wasn't just the legal complexity, but the political implications. The city council members who'd passed the ordinance were well connected politically. The developers challenging it had ties to influential business leaders. The community groups supporting the ordinance represented voters who could influence future judicial retention elections. Judge Hernandez had warned me about this aspect of judicial service during one of our mentoring sessions. "The law is clear about what you should consider in making decisions," she'd said. "Everything else is noise, but it's loud noise that never stops." She was right. My phone rang constantly with calls from reporters wanting quotes, from attorneys fishing for hints about my thinking, from political operatives trying to gauge which way I might rule. I'd learned to refer all inquiries to my clerk and to avoid any statements that could be construed as prejudging the case. The pressure was intense, but it was also clarifying. Every phone call I didn't take, every social invitation I declined, every attempt at influence I deflected, reinforced my commitment to making decisions based solely on legal merit. This was what judicial independence meant in practice, the discipline to ignore everything except the law and the facts. My first major test came during a preliminary hearing on the Riverside case. The courtroom was packed with stakeholders, reporters, and curious attorneys. Catherine Morrison represented the developers, challenging the ordinance. The city was represented by their municipal attorney, a competent lawyer named James Chen who I'd worked with during my public defender days. Morrison's presentation was masterful. She systematically dismantled the city's legal arguments, citing federal constitutional provisions and Supreme Court precedents with the precision that had made her legendary in Arizona legal circles. Her command of constitutional law was impressive, but more than that, her ability to weave complex legal principles into a coherent narrative was exactly the kind of advocacy that made difficult cases manageable for judges. James Chen's response was thorough but less polished. He'd clearly done his homework, but he lacked Morrison's courtroom presence and her instinctive understanding of how to frame constitutional arguments for maximum impact. The city's position was legally defensible, but Morrison was making it look weak through superior advocacy. After both sides completed their presentations, I had to ask the kinds of probing questions that would help me understand the full scope of the constitutional issues involved. This was the aspect of judicial work I'd grown to love most, the intellectual challenge of analyzing complex legal problems in real time, testing the strength of arguments through careful questioning. "Ms. Morrison, your due process argument assumes that property owners have a constitutionally protected expectation in maintaining existing zoning classifications. Can you address the precedent in Village of Euclid versus Ambler Realty, which seems to give municipalities broader discretion in land use regulation?" It was a challenging question, one that went to the heart of her constitutional argument. Morrison's response was immediate and sophisticated, demonstrating exactly why she'd built such a formidable reputation. She distinguished the precedent I'd cited, explained how subsequent Supreme Court decisions had refined the analysis, and tied her argument back to more recent, constitutional developments. "Mr. Chen, the ordinance includes provisions for administrative review of development applications. How does that procedural framework address the due process concerns Ms. Morrison has raised?" Chen's answer was competent but less nuanced. He explained the city's review process clearly, but he missed an opportunity to connect it to broader constitutional principles about procedural due process. It was the kind of oversight that could make the difference in a close case. After the hearing, I spent the rest of the week researching every aspect of the constitutional questions involved. My law clerks helped by pulling relevant cases, but the analysis had to be mine. This decision would establish precedent for similar cases across Arizona, and it would be scrutinized by appellate courts if either side appealed. The research was consuming, but it was also invigorating. This was exactly the kind of work I dreamed about during those long nights studying constitutional law in community college. Every principle I'd learned, every case I'd analyzed, every theoretical framework I'd mastered was now being applied to resolve a real dispute with real consequences for real people. While I was immersed in legal research, my personal life was experiencing its own complications. Rachel had started calling more frequently, not just for family updates, but for what seemed like validation of her own career choices. She'd taken my comment about meaningful work seriously and was questioning whether her marketing job provided the kind of purpose she wanted from her professional life. "I keep thinking about what you said about building something meaningful," she told me during one of our phone conversations. "I spend my days creating campaigns for products that people don't really need, using psychological techniques to manipulate purchasing decisions. Is that contributing anything positive to the world?" It was a profound question, one that went to the heart of what made work satisfying versus what made it simply successful. Rachel was grappling with the difference between external measures of achievement and internal sense of purpose, the same tension I'd navigated during my own career transition. "What would meaningful look like for you?" I asked, echoing the question I'd posed during our family dinner. "I don't know exactly. But I see how passionate you are about your work, how you light up when you talk about constitutional law and judicial decisions. You found something that matters to you beyond just paying bills or impressing people." We talked for over an hour about career satisfaction, about the courage required to change directions professionally, about the difference between work that felt important and work that simply looked impressive. Rachel was at a crossroads, questioning assumptions she'd held for years about what constituted success. David was experiencing his own professional evolution. His work at Morrison Associates was technically excellent, but he'd started expressing interest in pro bono cases, in using his legal skills to help clients who couldn't afford high-end representation. The prestige of working at a top firm was still important to him, but it was no longer sufficient. "Watching your career has been eye-opening," he told me during a phone call. "You've built something that's both professionally successful and personally meaningful." Most of us in private practice feel like we have to choose between financial success and social impact. These conversations with Rachel and David were flattering, but they were also concerning. My siblings were looking to me for guidance about life choices, treating my career path as a model to emulate. The responsibility felt overwhelming, especially when I was still figuring out my own professional development. The pressure intensified when local media started covering my background more extensively. A feature article in Phoenix magazine described my journey from community college to the Superior Court bench, portraying me as an inspiration for non-traditional students pursuing professional careers. The article was positive, but the attention was uncomfortable. Suddenly, I was receiving invitations to speak at community colleges, to mentor pre-law students, to serve on committees focused on increasing diversity in the legal profession. Every invitation was flattering, but each one also represented time away from the judicial work that was my primary responsibility. Judge Hernandez helped me navigate these competing demands during one of our regular mentoring sessions. "The attention is natural," she explained. "Your story resonates because it's unusual, and because it challenges assumptions about who belongs in judicial roles. But you have to be careful not to let the inspiration narrative overshadow your judicial work." She was right. My value as a role model depended entirely on my effectiveness as a judge. If I allowed myself to be distracted by speaking engagements and mentoring opportunities, I could undermine the very achievements that made my story worth telling. The balance became easier to manage when I developed a simple criterion for outside activities. They had to enhance my ability to serve as a judge rather than simply capitalize on my judicial position. Speaking at law schools about constitutional interpretation qualified because it forced me to articulate my judicial philosophy clearly. Serving on diversity committees qualified because understanding different perspectives made me a better judge. Social invitations that were purely about my newfound status did not. Meanwhile, the Riverside development case was approaching decision time. I'd completed my research, analyzed all the relevant precedents, and consulted with my law clerks about the constitutional implications of various possible rulings. The legal principles were clear, but their application to this specific set of facts required careful analysis. The city's ordinance was constitutional under existing Supreme Court precedent, but it pushed the boundaries of what municipalities could require from developers. Morrison's constitutional challenge was creative and well argued, but it required extending existing doctrine in ways that seemed inconsistent with the Supreme Court's current approach to property rights and due process. My decision would disappoint one side completely, but it would be based entirely on legal analysis rather than political considerations or personal preferences. This was what judicial independence meant: the willingness to follow the law wherever it led, regardless of external pressures or personal consequences. As I began drafting my opinion, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 3 years ago, I'd been highlighting constitutional law passages in a used textbook, trying to understand abstract principles that seemed removed from practical application. Now I was applying those same principles to resolve real disputes, creating legal precedent that would influence future cases. The intellectual satisfaction was profound, but it was accompanied by weight of responsibility that I hadn't fully anticipated. Every word, in my opinion, would be scrutinized by appellate courts, analyzed by legal scholars, and applied by future judges facing similar constitutional questions. The decision had to be not just correct, but clearly reasoned and thoroughly explained. My phone rang while I was working on a particularly complex section of the opinion. Professor Williams from law school was calling to congratulate me on the Phoenix magazine article and to discuss the scholarship program that would bear my name. "The response has been incredible, Emma. We've received donations from attorneys across the state who want to support non-traditional students pursuing legal careers. Your story has inspired people to think differently about who can succeed in law." The scholarship fund was approaching 6 figures, enough to provide meaningful support for several students each year. The donors included some of the most prominent attorneys in Arizona, people who'd never met me but who understood the value of expanding access to legal education. "We're planning to announce the first recipients at the State Bar Conference next month," Professor Williams continued. "It would mean a lot if you could present the scholarships personally." The Bar Conference was where I'd be giving my presentation about innovative judicial approaches to constitutional analysis. Adding a scholarship presentation would make it an even more significant moment, but it would also increase the visibility and pressure. After we hung up, I returned to work on my opinion, but the conversation with Professor Williams had reminded me of something important. My success as a judge wasn't just personal achievement. It was expanding possibilities for other people who'd been told their dreams were unrealistic. The scholarship recipients would face the same skepticism I'd encountered, the same questions about whether someone from their background could succeed in law. My visible success gave them evidence that unconventional paths could lead to professional achievement, that determination could overcome structural barriers. This realization didn't change my approach to judicial decision-making, but it deepened my understanding of why my work mattered beyond the specific cases I decided. Every thoughtful opinion, every well-reasoned decision, every demonstration of judicial competence strengthened the argument for diversity in judicial appointments. The Riverside opinion was nearing completion when Catherine Morrison called my chambers. She wasn't calling about the pending case, which would have been inappropriate, but about a different constitutional matter where she wanted to understand my judicial philosophy. "Your Honor, I'm working on a case that involves similar constitutional issues to some of your recent decisions. I wondered if you'd be willing to speak at our firm's continuing legal education seminar about constitutional interpretation in civil litigation. Morrison Associates hosting a CLE seminar on constitutional law, with me as the featured speaker, would put me in front of the most sophisticated legal audience in Arizona. It would also demonstrate that the state's most prestigious law firm considered my constitutional analysis worth studying. I'd be honored to participate, Ms. Morrison, assuming it doesn't create any conflicts with pending cases. Of course. We'll work around your judicial calendar completely." After she hung up, I realized that Catherine Morrison's invitation represented something significant. 6 months ago, she might not have known my name. Now she was inviting me to educate her firm's attorneys about constitutional law. The transformation from unknown public defender to respected constitutional analyst had happened faster than I'd expected. The week ended with completion of my Riverside Development Opinion. 28 pages of constitutional analysis, explaining why the city's ordinance satisfied due process requirements while acknowledging the legitimate concerns raised by the developers. The decision was legally sound, but it was also accessible, written in language that non-lawyers could understand, while maintaining the precision required for appellate review. My law clerks reviewed the opinion for technical errors and citation format. My research was thorough, my reasoning was clear, and my conclusion followed logically from established constitutional principles. This was the kind of judicial work I'd aspired to produce: thoughtful, well-researched, clearly explained. Sunday dinner with my family had become a regular tradition. This week, the conversation focused on my upcoming speaking engagements and the scholarship program announcement. Rachel and David seemed genuinely proud of my achievements, but they were also processing their own career reconsiderations. "I've been thinking about what you said about meaningful work," Rachel said as we finished eating. "I'm considering applying to graduate school for nonprofit management. I want to use my marketing skills for organizations that are actually helping people." David nodded supportively. "I've started taking on more pro bono cases at the firm. Catherine Morrison has been very encouraging about attorneys developing expertise in public interest law alongside our commercial work. My siblings were finding their own paths toward more purposeful careers, inspired partly by my example but ultimately driven by their own evolving values." The conversation that had started with Rachel calling me pathetic for having unrealistic dreams had led to all of us questioning what kinds of dreams were worth pursuing. As they were leaving, Rachel hugged me with the warmth that had become natural between us again. "I'm proud of who you've become, Emma, but more than that, I'm grateful that you didn't listen to me when I tried to discourage you." The week ahead would bring the release of my Riverside decision, reactions from the legal community, and continued preparation for the State Bar Conference presentation. Each challenge was an opportunity to demonstrate that my judicial appointment had been merited, that my constitutional analysis was sophisticated, and that non-traditional paths to judicial service could produce excellent results. My phone buzzed with a text from Judge Hernandez. "Looking forward to your bar conference presentation. The legal community is eager to hear your insights on constitutional interpretation." 3 years after Rachel had dismissed my law school dreams as pathetic delusions, I was being invited to share my constitutional analysis with the state's most accomplished attorneys and judges. The transformation was complete, but the work was just beginning. The Arizona State Bar Annual Conference was held at the Phoenix Convention Center, and walking into that massive hall filled with hundreds of the state's most accomplished legal professionals felt like stepping into a different universe. The same universe where Catherine Morrison moved with natural confidence, where judges and senior partners discussed complex legal theories over coffee, where my presence 3 years ago would have been as a server refilling water glasses, not as a featured speaker. My presentation was scheduled for the main conference room at 2 o'clock, right after lunch when attention spans typically waned but audience expectations remained high. The topic I'd chosen, constitutional innovation in modern civil litigation, had attracted more registrations than the conference organizers had anticipated. They'd had to move my session to the largest available space and were still expecting standing room only. Judge Hernandez found me in the speaker's lounge an hour before my presentation, looking over my notes one final time. She sat down beside me with the easy confidence of someone who'd given dozens of similar presentations over her career. "Nervous?" she asked, though my hands shaking slightly as I flipped through my index cards probably answered her question. "Terrified," I admitted. Speaking to attorneys is one thing, but this audience includes appellate judges, law school deans, senior partners from every major firm in the state. What if my analysis isn't sophisticated enough? What if they think my constitutional interpretation is too simplistic? Judge Hernandez smiled the way she had during my most anxious moments as an extern in her chambers. "Emma, you're invited to speak because your constitutional analysis has impressed people who don't impress easily. Catherine Morrison specifically requested that you be included in this year's program. The Arizona Supreme Court has cited your opinions favorably. Your insights aren't just sophisticated, they're innovative." She was right, but knowing that intellectually didn't calm the physical symptoms of anxiety that were making it difficult to concentrate on my presentation materials. This was the largest, most prestigious audience I'd ever addressed, and my remarks would likely be covered by legal publications and discussed in law schools across the region. "Remember why you're here," Judge Hernandez continued. "Not because you're the feel-good story of the girl who overcame obstacles, but because you're producing excellent judicial work that other legal professionals want to understand and learn from." Her words helped clarify something important. I wasn't at this conference as a symbol or an inspiration, but as a judge whose constitutional analysis had earned respect from peers. My presentation should focus on legal substance, not personal narrative. The conference room was indeed packed when I arrived. The front rows were filled with appellate judges, law school faculty, and senior attorneys whose names I recognized from high-profile cases. Catherine Morrison sat in the third row, notepad ready, looking as professionally attentive as she did in courtroom settings. David was there too, along with several colleagues from Morrison Associates. But what surprised me most was seeing my parents in the back of the room. Dad was wearing his best suit, the one he reserved for weddings and funerals, and Mom had her phone ready to record everything. They'd driven down from Phoenix specifically to hear me speak, treating this presentation like the milestone it represented. Rachel wasn't there, but she'd texted that morning, "Wish I could be there to hear you speak." David says the legal audience is incredibly prestigious. "So proud of how far you've come." As I walked to the podium, the conversation in the room gradually quieted. Hundreds of faces turned toward me with expressions of polite attention and professional curiosity. These were people accustomed to hearing from the most accomplished legal minds in the state, and they were waiting to see what insights I could offer. Constitutional law in civil litigation has evolved significantly over the past decade. I began, my voice stronger than I'd expected. Traditional approaches to due process analysis, particularly in cases involving government regulation of private property, are being challenged by new factual circumstances that don't fit neatly into established precedential frameworks. The opening seemed to capture the audience's attention. I could see people leaning forward slightly, pens moving across notepads, the kind of engaged listening that indicated genuine professional interest rather than polite tolerance. I spent the first 15 minutes outlining recent developments in constitutional jurisprudence, citing Supreme Court cases and appellate decisions that had refined traditional analytical approaches. This was foundational material that everyone in the room understood, but I was presenting it as groundwork for more innovative analysis. The challenge facing trial court judges is applying these evolving constitutional principles to factual situations that are becoming increasingly complex, I continued. The Riverside development case that recently came before my court illustrates how traditional due process analysis must be adapted to address modern regulatory schemes. I could see Catherine Morrison nodding slightly as I described the constitutional issues in the Riverside case. She'd argued that case brilliantly, and my analysis of her arguments was generating visible interest from the audience. Rather than simply applying established precedent mechanically, judges must engage in what I call constitutional synthesis, integrating multiple doctrinal strands to address novel factual circumstances while remaining faithful to fundamental constitutional principles. The concept of constitutional synthesis was something I'd developed through my own judicial experience, a framework for handling cases where existing precedent provided guidance but not definitive answers. It was the kind of theoretical contribution that could influence how other judges approached similar analytical challenges. For the next 20 minutes, I walked through specific examples of how this synthetic approach had guided my decisions in various cases. I explained how traditional constitutional analysis could be enhanced without abandoning established doctrine, how innovation in legal reasoning could coexist with respect for precedent. The audience was fully engaged now. I could see judges taking detailed notes, law professors exchanging meaningful glances, senior attorneys nodding in recognition of analytical challenges they'd encountered in their own practices. The goal isn't to revolutionize constitutional interpretation, but to ensure that constitutional principles remain relevant and applicable as factual circumstances evolve, I concluded. Trial court judges are uniquely positioned to identify when traditional analytical approaches need refinement, and our decisions can contribute to the ongoing development of constitutional doctrine. The applause was immediate and sustained, the kind of professional acknowledgement that indicated the presentation had succeeded in offering valuable insights rather than simply meeting expectations. Several people in the front rows were already approaching the podium with questions before the formal Q&A period began. Judge Patricia Valdez from the Arizona Court of Appeals was first. Your Honor, your synthetic approach to constitutional analysis is intriguing. How do you ensure that innovation in legal reasoning doesn't undermine the predictability that practitioners need from judicial decisions? It was exactly the kind of sophisticated question I'd hoped for, one that demonstrated the audience was taking my analytical framework seriously enough to probe its limitations and practical applications. Predictability comes from consistent application of legal principles, not from rigid adherence to specific analytical formulas, I replied. The synthetic approach I've described actually enhances predictability by providing a systematic method for addressing novel circumstances rather than forcing them into inappropriate precedential categories. Professor Martinez from Arizona State University Law School followed up. Judge Martinez, you've described this approach as emerging from trial court experience. Do you see constitutional synthesis as particularly relevant to trial judges, or does it have applications at the appellate level as well? Constitutional synthesis is most necessary at the trial court level, because that's where novel factual circumstances first encounter legal analysis, I explained. But appellate courts can certainly incorporate synthetic reasoning when reviewing trial court decisions, or when addressing cases that don't fit comfortably within existing precedential frameworks. For 30 minutes, the questions continued at this level of sophistication. These weren't softball inquiries designed to make me look good, but serious analytical challenges from people who understood constitutional law deeply and wanted to test the practical application of my theoretical framework. Dean Richardson from the University of Arizona Law School asked about the relationship between constitutional synthesis and originalist interpretation. Senior partner Williams from one of Phoenix's oldest law firms wanted to know how this approach would affect litigation strategy. Judge Thompson from the Superior Court in Tucson was interested in practical implementation challenges. Each question allowed me to demonstrate not just that I'd developed an interesting theoretical framework, but that I'd thought through its practical implications and potential criticisms. This was the kind of intellectual engagement I dreamed about during those long nights studying constitutional law in community college. When the formal session ended, the informal conversations began immediately. Catherine Morrison approached the podium first, her expression reflecting the kind of professional respect I'd seen her show only to the most accomplished attorneys. Judge Martinez, that was exceptional. Your constitutional synthesis framework addresses analytical challenges I've been grappling with for years. Would you be willing to discuss this approach with our appellate practice group? We handle cases across the Southwest, and this kind of innovative analysis could benefit clients facing similar constitutional issues. Behind her, a line of judges, law professors, and senior attorneys was forming, each waiting to continue the conversation. Judge Hernandez stood nearby, beaming with the pride of a mentor whose student had exceeded expectations. Dean Richardson reached the podium next. Your Honor, we'd love to have you as a guest lecturer in our constitutional law seminar. Your synthetic approach could be incredibly valuable for students preparing for practice in an evolving legal landscape. Professor Martinez from ASU was equally enthusiastic. Judge Martinez, have you considered developing this framework into a law review article? The theoretical contributions you've outlined could influence constitutional analysis well beyond Arizona. For the next hour, I moved through conversations that would have been impossible to imagine 3 years earlier. These weren't people being polite to the inspiring success story, but legal professionals engaging with analytical contributions they found genuinely valuable. My parents waited patiently through all these professional discussions, clearly understanding that they were witnessing something significant, even if the technical legal details were beyond their expertise. When the crowd finally thinned, Dad approached with tears in his eyes. Mija, I don't understand all the legal words, but I could see how those important people were listening to you. They respected what you were saying. They respect her because she's earned it, Mom added, hugging me with fierce pride. Our daughter, teaching constitutional law to judges and professors. The drive home gave me time to process what had just happened. The presentation had succeeded beyond my most optimistic expectations, but more than that, it had established me as someone who could contribute to legal scholarship at the highest levels. I wasn't just applying existing constitutional principles competently, I was helping to develop new analytical frameworks that other judges and attorneys could use. My phone rang as I pulled into my driveway. Judge Hernandez's name appeared on the screen. "Emma, I've been fielding calls for the past hour from people who attended your presentation. The response has been remarkable. Judge Crawford from the Court of Appeals specifically mentioned that your constitutional synthesis framework could influence how their court approaches certain categories of cases." The Arizona Court of Appeals was where Judge Hernandez now served, the court that would review my decisions if they were appealed. Having appellate judges express interest in my analytical approaches suggested that my trial court work was developing broader influence within the state judicial system. "There's something else," Judge Hernandez continued. "The Judicial Selection Commission has been discussing the need for judges who understand constitutional law from both traditional and innovative perspectives. Your presentation today demonstrated exactly that combination." The Judicial Selection Commission was responsible for screening candidates for appellate court appointments. Judge Hernandez wasn't making any promises, but she was suggesting that my constitutional analysis was attracting attention at levels where judicial careers were shaped. That evening, I received emails from conference attendees wanting copies of my presentation materials, invitations to speak at other legal conferences, and requests for follow-up conversations about specific aspects of constitutional synthesis. The academic and professional responses indicated that my presentation had generated the kind of sustained interest that could influence my long-term career trajectory. Rachel called around 9 o'clock, having heard about the presentation from David, who'd stayed for several of the post-session conversations. "David said your presentation was incredible, that you had appellate judges asking sophisticated questions about your constitutional theories. He's never seen that level of professional engagement at a state bar conference." "It went better than I expected," I admitted, still processing the afternoon's events. "Emma, do you realize what this means? 3 years ago, I called you pathetic for thinking you could study law. Today, you were teaching constitutional law to the most accomplished legal professionals in Arizona." The Kibeshiva contrast was stark, but it also highlighted how much both of us had changed over those 3 years. Rachel was no longer the person who'd measured success solely by conventional markers, and I was no longer the person who'd needed her validation to believe in my own potential. "David mentioned something else," Rachel continued. "Catherine Morrison told him that your constitutional analysis was some of the most innovative she'd encountered in recent years. Coming from her, that's extraordinary praise." Catherine Morrison's professional endorsement meant more than I could fully express. She represented the pinnacle of legal achievement in Arizona, and her recognition of my constitutional work validated years of effort that had sometimes felt like pushing against impossible odds. The week following the conference brought a flood of professional opportunities that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. Law schools wanted me as a guest lecturer. Legal publications requested articles about constitutional synthesis. Other judges sought my input on complex constitutional questions. Most significantly, I received a call from the Chief Judge of the Arizona Court of Appeals. Judge Crawford wanted to discuss potential collaboration on a project involving constitutional interpretation in complex civil litigation, exactly the kind of work that could position me for future appellate appointment. As I prepared for that conversation, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. From community college student to constitutional law scholar, from family disappointment to professional recognition, from pathetic nobody to respected judge whose analytical contributions were influencing legal development across the state. The girl who'd been told her dreams were unrealistic had become someone whose constitutional analysis was shaping how other judges approached their most challenging cases. The transformation was complete, but it had also opened doors to possibilities I hadn't even known existed. Catherine Morrison's words after my presentation echoed in my mind. "This is just the beginning, Your Honor. Constitutional scholars, with your analytical abilities and practical experience, are rare. The legal profession needs more judges who can bridge theoretical innovation with practical application. Rachel had called me a pathetic nobody, but she'd been wrong about everything except one crucial detail. I had been nobody. Nobody's expectation of judicial potential, nobody's prediction of constitutional scholarship, nobody's model of legal achievement. And that had been exactly what I needed, to become somebody who could surprise everyone, including myself. 2 years later, I was standing in the Arizona Supreme Court building, about to be sworn in as the youngest justice ever appointed to the state's highest court. The ceremony room was filled with the same people who'd once questioned whether I belonged in law at all. Rachel sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face, holding the hand of our parents who looked like they were witnessing a miracle. Catherine Morrison was there too, now serving as my mentor in appellate practice. She'd been instrumental in my nomination, telling the Judicial Selection Commission that my constitutional scholarship had influenced legal thinking beyond Arizona's borders. My law review articles on constitutional synthesis had been cited by federal courts and taught in law schools across the country. David had taken a position as general counsel for a nonprofit organization, finding the meaningful work he'd been searching for. He'd tell anyone who'd listen that watching my career had inspired him to prioritize purpose over prestige. Rachel had completed her graduate degree and was now directing a coalition of nonprofits focused on educational equity. But the most meaningful presence in that ceremonial room was Judge Hernandez, who would administer my oath. She'd been appointed to the Arizona Supreme Court the year before, and having her swear me in felt like completing a circle that had begun in her chambers when I was just an uncertain law student. Do you, Emma Martinez, solemnly swear to support the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the State of Arizona, and to faithfully and impartially discharge the duties of Justice of the Supreme Court of Arizona according to the best of your ability and understanding, so help you God? I do, I said, my voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. The reception afterward was attended by governors, senators, federal judges, and attorneys who'd argued before the Supreme Court. Professor Williams was there, beaming with pride as he watched former students and colleagues congratulate his most unexpected success story. Catherine Morrison approached me during the reception, extending her hand with a smile that had become genuinely warm over our years of professional collaboration. Justice Martinez, she said, it's been an honor watching your career develop. Your constitutional analysis has elevated legal discourse in Arizona and beyond. Thank you, Ms. Morrison. Your mentorship made this possible. She shook her head. Your intellect and determination made this possible. I just recognized potential that was already there. As the evening wound down, Rachel found me on the courthouse steps looking out over downtown Phoenix where I'd once cleaned offices late at night while dreaming of a legal career that seemed impossible. Do you remember that night I called you pathetic? She asked softly. I remember, I replied. I was so wrong, Emma. Not just about your potential, but about what success looks like, about what dreams are worth pursuing, about who gets to matter in this world. We stood together, in comfortable silence, two sisters who'd found their way back to each other through honesty and growth. Rachel had discovered her own path to meaningful work, inspired partly by my example, but ultimately driven by her own evolving values. You know what I learned from watching your journey? Rachel said. That the people who tell you your dreams are too big are usually the ones whose dreams are too small. My phone buzzed with a message from a law student at Phoenix Community College. She'd heard my story and wanted advice about applying to law school. Her note ended with, "Everyone says my background makes law school unrealistic, but you prove that's not true." I typed back quickly, "Dreams don't require permission from people who can't envision them. Trust yourself." Standing on those courthouse steps as Arizona's newest Supreme Court justice, I thought about that scared 24-year-old who'd been told she was a pathetic nobody. She'd been right to ignore the skeptics, right to trust her instincts, right to believe that determination could transform impossible dreams into inevitable reality. The girl they'd written off had become the woman who would help interpret the Constitution for millions of Arizonans. Rachel's cruel words had been completely wrong, but they'd also been exactly what I needed to hear to prove them false. Sometimes the best revenge isn't proving people wrong. It's becoming so successful that their opinion becomes irrelevant. Justice Emma Martinez had a nice ring to it. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, You won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.